Hi, and welcome to the second module of Launch Your Podcast, a beginner's guide to podcasting. I am Samuel Adiri, the chief troublemaker at Podlove, and the guide for your course for this course for the next 2 weeks. In today's module, we will be taking a look at how podcasting works. In our last module, I explained to you what podcasting is all about and what makes it a podcast. I also told you the story of Tunde. But in this module, we just want to take a look at how podcasting really works. At the end of this module, you should be able to do the following. 1. Explain the 3 basic types of podcast shows that you can choose from. 2. Describe from start to finish how a podcast is created. 3. Determine the best podcast format for you. And lastly, explain the basic structure of a podcast show or episode. So let's delve right straight into today's module. First of all, we want to take a look at the different types of podcast format. When I say podcast format, I'm referring to basically who is responsible for creating your audio content. Now, the very first type of podcast format you can have right out there is the solo show. Now, the very first type of podcast format you can have right out there is the solo show. And the solo show is just you and the mic talking and discussing whatever content you have. You're the only one on your podcast. The disadvantage of this is sometimes it can be monotonous to your listener. They can get bored of listening to you week in, week out. But it has one strong advantage. It's easy to produce and manage. You don't have to call someone, or your consistency is not dependent on someone else or your guest or anything. So you can be as consistent as you want with a solo show. 2, we have the co-hosted podcast show. Now, this is where you and a couple of other people, maybe 1 or 2, it could be more than that, depending on how you can manage it, sit down together to talk about a podcast topic. Now, it's more interesting. Most listeners are more inclined to listen to a dialogue than a monologue. They find it more interesting, and it kind of brings life into the whole show. That's one strong point of a co-hosted podcast show. There's also the division of labor with editing. You can edit this week while someone else edit the following week. It's a show run by you guys, depending on the number of people or co-hosts that you have. Now, more people can also come up with ideas and content for your show. It means you can barely run out of ideas for your next episode. But it can be difficult to manage and even produce. Now, where you have ripped and all that, or someone decides it's not coming or showing up today, it can be some sort of inconsistency. Also, it takes a longer time to pull these people together and produce a show. The third type is the interview-based podcast show. Now, this is where you bring a guest onto the show and you talk and you interview him, maybe on his own live experience, or you talk about a particular topic that they're well-grounded or they're an authority in. It's best suited when you know little about your subject area, but you're very much interested in it. If you're the kind of listener who says, hey, everyone, this is what I'm trying to learn. Would you want to learn along with me? Like I am with Switch Podcast, you want to bring a guest onto your show. Now, you can reach more people because with each guest you bring onto your show, you can potentially reach out to the people that listen to them. Now, but it has one downside. The downside of it is quality guests can be difficult to get at times. Now, that's a story for another day because I experienced this on a couple of when I started out. But it tends to get better along the line once you can produce your content consistently and people begin to see what you're doing. They give you listening ears. But that does not take out the fact that the downside of this is quality guests can be difficult to get at times. Now, there are a few things I want you to remember. The very first one is the fact that yes, podcasting is flexible and not bounded by rules, but your listeners like to know what to expect. So you can be doing a solo show today, and tomorrow you're doing interview-based show, and the next day you're doing a co-hosted show. I always advise that yes, it might not just be one of this. Maybe I advise that you mix just two. I don't advise you mix the old three types of format. I run two types of format on Switch Podcast. I do the interview-based podcast, and I do the solo shows. You can choose to go with solo and co-hosted. You can choose to go with co-hosted and interview-based, where both of you, if it's a two, if you're just two on the show to co-host, where both of you can interview someone else, and the following week. But you want to be consistent with the kind and the timing of the podcast format you use in your show. Again, there are no rules binding you to do this. It's podcasted. It means you have to be creative. Just find a way to creatively blend all this together, putting in mind your listeners. We're moving on straight to the third part of this model, where we talk about the podcast workflow. Now, what exactly is the podcast workflow? The podcast workflow describes how you create each of your episodes from start to finish. It's like when you're trying to cook. You have a recipe. There's a new meal, there's a new dish, or there's a new dish that you want to cook, and you don't know how to do it before. The best thing to do is get someone to show you how to do it, or better still, get a recipe. Now you're trying to launch a podcast. You need a recipe for creating a podcast, and that is what a podcast workflow is all about. There are basically steps and procedures you follow from the point you conceived an idea for your episode down to a point where you promote your podcast episode. The very first step, or the very first procedure, is to record your episode. Now, you could do this depending on the kind of show you're on. If it's interview-based or co-hosted, you could do this in person, where you have the people physically present with you and with your own recording gadget set up and all that. Or you could do it via Skype. I'm not too inclined with Skype for the number of reasons. I feel relationships are built when you see them. But of course, there'll be situations where it's not possible to reach out to your client, reach out to your guest or your co-host physically. Skype can help you solve that. You could record using your smartphone. You could record using your recorder, a microphone, or a combination of all this. Details of how you can record and different setups for different situations will be discussed in Module 4, recording gears and software options, and also in Module 5, where we talk about tips on improving your recording. Step 2, edit this episode. Now, when we talk about editing, this is a stage where you introduce your intro, your segment, your midro, the name I gave it, your outro, and your background music. This is where you make it cooler. What you had previously is just a recording. This is a stage where you make it cute. This is a stage where you add your own uniqueness. This is a stage where you make it presentable. Now, the length of time you spend in this stage, in this step, is affected by your recording style and sophistication. Now, if you add so many errors, so many problems with your recording, it's going to reflect when you're editing your episode. It means you're going to spend a longer time editing your episode. And I must warn you, editing can take a long time. In the beginning, I used to spend close to 6 to 8 hours or even more recording and editing a 15-minute clip until I began to learn about ways to make my recording better, so that I spend less time editing my episode. Now, editing can be done with Audacity or Adobe Audition. I use Audacity, but we will discuss this in details in Module 6, where we'll talk about editing your podcast. The third step is tagging your episode. Have you ever lost a dog before or a cat before, and people see the cat or the dog or the pet, I beg your pardon, on the road, and they can't see where the dog is coming from or where the pet is coming from? Why am I saying dog? Because I like dogs. Where the pet is coming from, because it has no tag. Say, for example, it carries a tag where it has the address and the name of the dog. It's easier for a stranger to be able to trace that dog back to your home. So when we talk about tagging is a stage where you add extra information to your MP3 for media players to understand and display this information correctly. Information like your name, I was about to say information, like your name, episode title, your own title, your podcast name, and artwork are displayed correctly when you tag your podcast episode. The beauty about this is for every episode, you can brand your episode in the mind, subconsciously in the mind of your listener, and make it easy for them to trace that episode back to you. So don't forget that it's possible that someone else shared your content with someone via Bluetooth, and that person never heard about your website, didn't download it directly from you, shares it with another person. If that third person is trying to get to know about your show, it's just your tagging, it's your metadata, that's the technical name for the information you add, that makes them trace their way back to you. We'll talk about this in details in Module 7, tagging your podcast. Now, straight up to the fourth step. Now, you're done tagging this MP3. It's now a podcast episode. It's an MP3 file, well created. You need to upload this to your media server. It's never advisable to upload your podcast directly to your website. Of course, there are reasons for this that will be discussed in the module, but dedicated servers like Libsyn, SoundCloud, Archive, Amazon S3, RMedia, Podmatic, so many of them out there. These are just a few of them. A few of them I recommend. These media servers are dedicated media servers that can handle the file size and the traffic size that your podcast can build at the end of the day. Details will be discussed in Module 8, Media Hosting for your podcast. The fifth stage is to create your show notes. Now, it's audio. Nobody can automatically understand what is contained in an audio file, except from the title and a short description about it. Your show notes is a short description about your episode. It is that article that comes along your episode. They're important for two reasons. One, a quick episode description, so it allows a visitor know, okay, is this what I really want to listen to? Two, for SEO purposes. SEO is search engine optimization. The better your podcast notes, show notes are, the more easy for people to search for your content and find you by any search engine. Two, it should not be less than 300 words. Yes, I advise nothing less. There are other podcasts out there with shorter show notes, but I advise that you have nothing less than 300 words. This is enough for you to create a well-prepared article that passes all the search engine optimization criteria. The sixth step is schedule your episode. Now, excuse me, I know some tutorials out there, and even the people I learn from don't put this schedule your episode. But I can tell you, the more you strive for scheduling your episode, the more consistent you can become. Now, it just allows you automatically, WordPress allows you to do that, which should be the foundation, the content management system for your website. It allows you to schedule your episode so that on a specific date. With podcasting, consistency is very important for you in building an audience. People don't want to check. Imagine in those days when, if we still watch Superstory, yeah. Imagine if Superstory was released on a Monday this week, and the following week you canceled all other appointments by 8:00. You got home early and you settled down in front of your TV, and nothing from Wale Denuga production from WAP. And you discovered that it went live on Tuesday. The following week on Thursday. Tell me, would you have been able to stick with Superstory for how long you stuck with it or how long you stayed with it? No. So scheduling your episodes allows you come online, and I can be, I strive for this too. But it allows you come online, allows your episode come online at the time that you give in to your listeners. The 7th stage is publish your episode. Once you're working with WordPress, and you've scheduled your episode, this is done automatically. The 8th stage or the 8th step is to promote your episode. Now, you can't just throw out the content out there. There are over, according to Cliff, I hope I'm getting this right, there are over 450 million blogs out there. There are probably even up to 500 million by now, because people create blogs and create websites every day. 500 million people to compete with, and you can't promote your website or promote your content. Nobody's going to see you. The marketplace is so crowded that you need to promote your episode. So go out there via social media, directly to your friends, push out your content to them. We'll talk about this, I think, in Module 10. We'll talk about how you can promote your podcast episode. And yeah, the last stage is, man, chill out. You've done a great job coming from 1 to 8 and to 9. The best thing you want to do at this point is to chill out, man. And just, just chill out. And then after you chill out for a while, you have to pick your mic again and think about your next episode. So the workflow is cyclic. You come back to recording your episode. But this is what you do. This is the framework of what you have to go through. There are probably 1 or 2 other steps that you would include to customize it based on your own experience. But this is a cyclic workflow that you have to do every single time you're recording an episode. Now, we're moving to the 3rd part and the last part of this model, which is your podcast structure. Your podcast or your episode structure, I beg your pardon, refers to how contents are arranged in your podcast. It gives you clarity when you're recording and editing your episode. Now, what you have below here is a basic structure, but it is by no means prescriptive. It's just a guide for you. So there is the intro, followed by the body, and what I call the mid-tro as a break. There's no word like mid-tro, but I figured out that if you have intro and outro, that whatever you put in the middle can as well be called mid-tro, right? So after the mid-tro comes again your body, and then after your body comes the outro. For some podcasts, it's just basically intro, the body, and outro. So yeah, we want to talk basically about these different components, and the first one we're talking about is your intro. Your intro basically introduces your listener to your podcast show and the content of that particular episode. Now, it can contain 1 or more of the following, but they're not limited to what your show is about, to your episode number, 3, what the episode in particular is about, 4, the episode highlight, and 5, your sponsor's message. So you could have a combination of 1 or 2 or 3 of the following, but I don't advise you to put all 5 in your intro. You want your intro as short as possible so that you don't lose your listener from the beginning. The second part we will be talking about is the body of your episode. Now, the body of your episode refers to the content of your episode. It's the main reason why your listener downloaded your episode in the first place, not your intro. Now, it breaks down the title of the episode into understandable bits for your listener. It basically explains what the title is all about. Now, everything else in your body is up to you and your creative mind. How you create it depends a whole lot of it. This is where a lot of podcasters differentiate themselves. Now, put into consideration also the needs of your ideal listeners. Yes, your show is your show. And it can be about you, but you don't want to sound as being saucy. You don't want to sound naive. You don't want to sound cut out from the real world. You also want to put into consideration, into the bigger frame, into the whole, because of course it's eventually for the people who are listening to you. So put into consideration the needs of your ideal listeners. But before we go, I want to basically talk about the 7 qualities of a great podcast content. Now, your podcast content is basically your talks a lot more about your body. The very first one is it has to be authentic. Oh my goodness. This is the foundation of your podcast success. Authenticity is very, very important. People can smell your fake voice far away from you. They can smell it when you're lying with your voice. They would eventually find out. And when you're trying to be what you're not on your show, and then they meet you real life and your voice is significantly different. Oh my goodness. Or you're not what you say you are on your show. You've not only destroyed your show, you've also destroyed your own integrity. So try as much as possible. Be very authentic with your show. I'm not saying you should sound Raz, but if Raz is the value proposition of your podcast, then let it be. But I'm just saying, be real as much as possible. 2, let it correlate with your headline. You don't want to give a different headline. They call it clickbait in YouTube, where the headline is just to attract people to click, and at the end of the day, the content is nowhere near what the headline says it would be. You don't want to do that. You can't gain trust using that method. 3, it should not be longer than it should be. So I'm not going to say that your podcast should be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 hour, 10 hours. If you do a 10 hours podcast, just be very sure I won't listen to it, and I'm sure quite a number of people won't listen to it. But it shouldn't be longer than it should be. Now, you listen to certain things and you know that this podcast should not be longer than 15 minutes, and some people drag it to an hour. Make sure that your content, every part of it, is as relevant as much as possible. Your podcast content should not be longer than it should be. 4, it should be structured. Now, you're talking about the podcast that describes how to dress properly, and you didn't give an introduction, and you went straight to the types of trousers to wear, and then you come back to give an introduction, and then you talk about accessories, you talk about colors. You need your content to be structured, because you're not just talking. There are people who are listening to you, who are trying to follow your order, who are trying to follow the logic behind your argument. You want your podcast content to be structured, else you will lose that listener. It must provide value, it must be thought-provoking, and it must be engaging. The essence of podcasting is so that you can create value for other people via audio. 6, it should be actionable. You want to give your podcast listeners something to do. You can go talking about 45 minutes about a topic, and at the end of the day, you're leaving them hanging. Give them something to do. After your episode, describe one single thing you want them to do after it. And 7, reference other people's content you've used in your podcast. Now, if you've read an article online, do your best bet to reference that article. It does not make you sound less, how would I put it? It does not make you sound less of a person. For this podcast, I told you earlier in the beginning, I learned from Cliff Ravenscraft. I learned from Pat Flynn. I also learned from Lee Dumas. A couple of other people, Daniel Lewis. I ended up finding out the podcasting school of podcasting or thereabout, how to podcast. These are people whose knowledge, whose teachings influenced what I'm doing here today, coupled with my experience with podcasting here in Nigeria. I'm not ashamed to say I learned from these people, because yes, I actually learned from them. So make it easy for your listeners. Reference other people's content that you have used in your podcast. Now, we'll be talking about the mid-show. The mid-show is basically just to give your listeners a break. It is best suited for long podcasts. Now, if you hear me ramble, and talk for a long period of time, you get tired at some point. A break allows you get yourself back. It allows your listeners, or you get yourself back into what I'm saying, or into what you're saying, and let them follow you from that point on. So it could contain one or more of the following. It could just be a short musical break. It could be a message from your sponsor. Beg your pardon. It could be a segment where your podcast stands out. So this segment could be tip of the day, reviews, short stories, breaking news, interview, vox pop, etc. This is where you can be very creative. And yeah, basically, that's the end of Metro. I thought I had one more point down there. But anyway, I talked about body already, talked about Metro, and now we're talking about the outro. This is the concluding part of your podcast. This comes immediately after your body, and it can contain one or more of the following, but again, not limited to a call to action. Like I said in the 7 qualities of a great podcast content, give your listeners something to do. You put that in your outro. Social media links. Hey, follow us on so and so. But I notice people barely do that. So I prefer call to action to it. But it's up to you. Toward website links, of course, mention the website they can download more exciting episodes from. And 4, a preview of the next episode. So if you've done an interview and broken it into 2, you can say, okay, in our next episode, we'll continue the interview with so and so. It creates continuity. And 5, announcements. So for the new year, I switched, my team and I, beg your pardon, switched podcast timing from Wednesday to Friday. I made that announcement in the outro of the first episode, which is episode 22. I made that announcement in the outro. Because, yeah, you don't want to do that in the beginning. You may do that in the beginning, but I advise it comes at the outro. Yes, congratulations to you. And that brings us to the end of this module. But before you go, like I said, the qualities of a great content, action point. This is what I want you to do. First of all, I want you to write out the 9 general steps you need to follow when creating a podcast. Do this without copying. 2, listen to at least 3 different podcasts. You might want to listen to Switch and Raise Your Podcast at www.podlove.com and some other podcast. Can you identify the kind of show they are? The third one is write out the 5. Oh, I noticed notice the error. Can you still identify? Identify is missing there. Yeah, but I said what you should do. So the third point I have for you, the third action point I have for you is to write out the 5 possible components that makes up the structure of a typical podcast episode. Now, you may want to send me an email at samueladiri@podlove.com. I'd love to know what you have on that sheet of paper that you've just written down all your answers. Once again, congratulations for coming this far. 2nd module out of 10. Man, kudos. In our next module, we will be talking about the things you should prepare before you each record. I remain Samuel Adiri, the chief troublemaker at Podlove, your course guide for this course, and I'm saying bye for now. I'll see you in our next episode. I'll see you in our next module.